All right, welcome to tonight's episode of We the Individuals Live, where we believe in the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. With me, as usual, I have the founder and owner of We the Individuals, Jeff Peterson II, and of course, Andy Catherman, our fellow admin. And I'm Chris Cowton. I forgot to introduce myself last episode, so I'm keeping that up here. And we're very excited to have a special guest with us tonight, none other than Dan Sanchez, who is the coordinator of Mises University, which I know many of
No, it's
us are
Mises.
familiar with.
I'm sorry, it's Mises Academy.
Mises Academy, I'm so sorry. And you're also a columnist for antiwar.com, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful, wonderful. So anybody, if you're not familiar with Dan's writings, he is a wonderful libertarian writer, writes a lot regarding war and some of the left libertarian topics that we're going to be talking about tonight, and you can access a plethora of articles at dansanchez.me. Definitely worth your time. Now, before we get into anything, Dan, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you that when I was familiarizing myself with your articles recently, because I haven't known about you as long as Jeff and Andy have, I'm worried that we're not going to be able to strike up much of a friendship, because when I was reading some of your articles, I was feeling a little triggered. I felt emotionally assaulted in one article in particular when you were downing my man, Mark Miller, and the Ultimates comic books, which are one of my favorite comic book series. And I'm going to give you a trigger warning. I am not a big fan of Grant Morrison.
Oh,
Why
no.
should I change my mind on this?
Okay. Would you say why should you change your mind on this?
Yeah, why should I change my mind on this?
Okay. Well, just to specify that, like, even Grant Morrison himself likes Mark Millar, and I like Mark Millar too, sort of more as a guilty pleasure. But the article you're talking about is where I talk about the militarization of the superhero.
Right, Grant Morrison versus the Super Soldier is the title of the article.
Yes, the title is Grant Morrison versus the Super Soldiers, and so what I do is I use Grant Morrison's recent statement at Comic-Con, where he talks about how he's basically kind of fed up with the comic book, the traditional American superheroes, because of how the degree to which they've been militarized, and he has this great book called Super Gods, where it's sort of part autobiography and part history of the comic book industry, and part metaphysical contemplation of spirituality, and it's a really interesting book. And they're sort of running as a thread throughout that book is just this opposition to the militarization of the superhero, and he traces it all the way back to sort of the grim and gritty era of the 80s and going into the 90s. But at least about that era, he says that a lot of times superheroes could be militarized, they could be government stooges, but in the 80s and 90s, at least they were recognized as government stooges. So one of the examples that he gives is in the graphic novel The Dark Knight Returns. Superman in that story is actually a stooge of Ronald Reagan, of all people. And but in stories like that, that is represented as sort of like a fall from grace, like a fall from what superheroes are supposed to be. Whereas later on, especially after 9/11, what you get is superheroes preening and really being proud of being a government stooge. They consider them as like themselves as government badasses, and that was really embraced, especially in a certain series called The Ultimates by Mark Millar. And that's where you really get the Avengers as sort of a government project, and where you have Captain America being really murderous and brutal in that, and it's all sort of being, and they have all this collateral damage, and innocent people are getting killed, and it's all justified, because of national security, basically. And so it really has kind of gotten out of hand in the comic book industry, and so that's kind of the story I tell in the article.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with all of that. Comic books, I can't put my politics into them, but I'm a huge comic book nerd, so I had to bring that up. I had to bust your chops a little bit on that. I'm a huge, huge Mark Miller fan. He's one of my favorite writers in the comic book world. But moving on to more serious things, of course, tonight's format's going to be a little bit different for the people that have seen some of our previous episodes. Instead of having a roundtable discussion, Jeff has some questions he's going to ask tonight that he actually gathered from some of our left libertarian counterparts to challenge Dan on, and Andy has some questions on thick and thin libertarianism, and I've got, of course, some of my own questions. So we all kind of want to pick your brain while we have the opportunity. The next thing I wanted to ask you about, Dan, is just the issue of war, because I think we're going to spend a lot of time on this thick, thin libertarian stuff, but you write for antiwar.com. That's one of your biggest issues that you like to tackle. And a lot of us, I mean, we know we're anti-war, but in terms of the topical stuff, I was reading your article, When War Hawks Coo Like Doves, which was just giving a lot of the hypocrisy with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama regarding Syria and Assad and Al-Qaeda. And this is a lot of stuff that I don't keep up with this. So what are your thoughts on these situations over there in the Middle East, Dan?
Well, in the article you mentioned, basically I make the case that, especially recently, a lot of these people in government have shown that they are fully aware of the anti-war arguments. It's not like they are, they're oblivious to them and then they're just making all these mistakes because they don't, they haven't heard from us enough. They know them well because they can actually use them for their own short-term agenda. Especially lately, we've been hearing a lot of anti-war type arguments being leveled by the Obama administration and his generals at Russia, because Russia has started bombing ISIS and other jihadist groups in Syria in defense of the Syrian regime there. And I also trace it back to in 2012, they were Obama and Hillary Clinton, and they were actually using anti-interventionist arguments whenever war hawks in the media were pressuring them to escalate faster in Syria. And they were using anti-war arguments in order to push back against that. And so it just really seems to me a trend of that, that they know these arguments, but so I kind of address the whole question of, stupid or evil, whether there's stupidity or evil behind these policies. And if they know the arguments, then that kind of lends towards the evil side of the scale. And of course, there's a lot of incompetence involved too, but it's not purely incompetence. And so basically, I mean, I'm against the Russian intervention. I don't, like what Ron Paul said, I wish nobody was bombing anybody in Syria. But at the same time, the United States, the officials, they don't have a leg to stand on in these criticisms. So some particular ones I raise is that they're using the blowback argument against Putin. So one,
which doesn't exist when we challenge them on it, right?
What's that?
The blowback theory doesn't exist when we challenge them on it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So one official was saying something to the effect of, if you kill innocent civilians, then you're just going to enrage people, and then you'll make them into terrorists.
Yeah. And
so Putin, how many terrorists are you creating for every one terrorist that you kill? And it's just, that's exactly what.
It was our strategy in Vietnam as well, and that's what I was thinking of when I read it. It was like, they don't, is that disconnect, or is it just known deniability? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just cynicism that they know the blowback that can come from their policies, that they just don't care. They're willing to incur that risk for the subjects, for their subjects, as long as it redounds to their own personal and political benefit.
What do you think that benefit is in their case?
Well, there's just career benefits, but mainly it's power. Like Randolph Bourne said that war is the health of the state,
Yeah.
and so what that means is that in war, that's when people become more and more like a herd because they're afraid, and so they want to, herd together for protection under one leader. And so the more people are alarmed, the more people are in a state of crisis, the more power they're willing to let their rulers have over them. And so it's all to the good. I mean, this whole cycle of interventionism, where one intervention creates a crisis that necessitates another intervention, which just makes things worse, and everything just gets progressively worse. That's to the benefit of them, because the more of a crisis we're in, the more scared people are, and the more they're willing to give up their liberties.
So it's all about the concentration of power. Yeah, I really like that insight on that. I know as much as the anti-war issue is super important to most of us libertarians, a lot of us just we neglect the facts and the details of the matters that can help make these arguments. So I think reading your article, it was really valuable to me to help make these arguments, because a lot of our liberal friends we can bring them into the libertarian circle with these starting points. So I do like that. I think you're doing good work there. I have one question that comes from Alex Franklin that I'm going to ask you before moving on to Jeff's question, because I think it's a good introduction to that. But Alex Franklin just kind of wanted your thoughts on this idea of social justice. Do you think it's a passing fad or a serious issue that we need to be worried about as liberty-minded people?
Well, I tend to agree with Hayek. F.A. Hayek was very critical of that term. For me, I think that the danger is that it takes away from individual justice, and so this notion of sort of a sense of justice that goes above and beyond individual justice. Well, the thing is that for any scarce resource, it's always an either-or question. Does this person or does this agency have the right to dispose of it? Like, which one? Like, it's an either-or. And so, with libertarianism, we have a very certain idea of individual rights, and we have an answer for a specific individual, depending on who homesteaded it, who contracted for it. We have a very specific answer about each one of those questions, and so the thing is that to the degree that some sort of social justice answer is different from that, well, that's necessarily an abrogation of someone's individual rights. So I'm not caught up on labels. I mean, if people are talking about the same assignment of rights as we are, and they're just calling it social instead of individual, I don't have a problem with that. But to the extent that they're using sort of this abstraction of society as a justification for depriving individuals of their rights, then I'm against that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that leads into a lot of Jeff's ongoing concerns with left libertarianism. And Jeff, I know that you had your own questions to pick Dan's brain on, so I'm going to let you take over for a moment.
Yeah, sure. You wrote the article. It was called, one second, the article in question was called, one moment. Okay, so in your article, Identity Politics and Warfare Sociology, you described a certain attribute to the left. and I'll quote you. It says, "The leftist sees the underdogs as inherent conflict with the top dogs in society. They want to lift the underdogs up, and according to their welfare sociology, the only way to affect that is to pull the top dogs down. This is why leftists clamor for the nanny state, which is one half welfare state to lift the underdogs up, and one half regulatory and tax state to pull the top dogs down. Thus, the defining attribute of the left is egalitarianism, since at least in the near term it involves the underdogs on their way up and the top dogs on their way down, converging toward equality. However, this egalitarianism may be dropped in the long term, especially for those Marxists and Marxoids whose ultimate warfare sociology objective is to expropriate and exterminate the top dogs." Now, that being said, one of my grievances with the left, be it statist left or libertarian left, is that your article, I read this after I kind of almost came to this conclusion, is that they share a common trait, which is this disdain for those with more agency, which is more money, more wealth, etc. That is, I'm convinced the left is more interested in harming those with more agency than it is for aiding those with less. And the left seems far more interested in abolishing prosperity than poverty, to the point that I don't even think they see soaking the rich as a means to an end. I suspect they see helping the poor as an excuse to harm rich people. So even though your article kind of touches base on the statist left, I think that the libertarian left share the contempt for human agency that I believe defines the left, but that they can do it without the state and strip everyone of everyone with too much authority. So I want to see if you agree with that grievance of mine, and if you think that it's a reason that left libertarians seem to dislike the accumulation of capital, or capitalism as known as private ownership of the means of production, since it results in inequality, which conflicts with their pursuance of equality and egalitarianism.
Well, I think at the extremes, that's true. That, for example, Thomas Piketty, there's one part where Bob Murphy shows that he even accepts the argument that the free market would actually help people more than his preferred way, but he's more concerned with hurting the top dogs than he is with helping the underdogs. So even if it means that everyone suffers, that he's okay as long as the rich people suffer more. And so that's sort of an implication of just, I don't know if his whole work is characterized by that, but that's an implication that Murphy teased out of at least one passage. And it kind of goes to there's an Orwell quote on the back of one of y'all's wall, and it sort of goes to an Orwell line from 1984 where he says that the totalitarian government of 1984, that they have gone where the Nazis and the communists, the Stalinists, couldn't go. That they didn't understand how to be a successful totalitarian, and the idea was that really to win lastingly, then you can't have any illusions about power being for the sake of any kind of ideal. That power is for the sake of power, they said, and it kind of gets at a concept that St. Augustine had of the libido dominandi, the lust to dominate, and so it really there's a certain degree of sadism to it, but you find that in the left and the right, just as in some right wingers that the right wing infringements of rights, like police beating on people or bombing people. Some right wingers just like hurting people. They just like the idea of people getting hurt. Like it gives them this sort of debased thrill. So I can see that with the left too. That some leftists that they're so extreme with their resentment and hatred of the rich or the advantaged in general, that that they just want to hurt them, even if it doesn't help, if it doesn't benefit any of their constituencies at all. They just want to hurt them, and so I can see that, but I do think that's only at the extremes, and I think both on the left and the right, there are people who are just willing to sacrifice other people's rights to an extent in order to benefit their favored constituencies.
Yeah, one of the things that I might have mentioned is that, or should have, is that one thing that that you kind of see in some of their writings that I've never really understood. Like for instance, when not only capital, but you know, in your article you say that they use the state to bring the top dogs down and to lift up the poorer people. I think that some of the things that they write about, it's kind of an underlying theme in their articles. So for instance, like since there wouldn't be a state around, they would use their own means to bring the rich down, which for instance, like occupancy and use is one reason kind of like shows that, because with occupancy and use, it prevents any incentive from someone accumulating capital when someone could just come in and, you know, reap or claim ownership of your property. And also in the articles, like you know, the concept of checking your privilege, one of the arguments is that checking privilege is nothing more than the relative advantage that not being oppressed confers on you compared to those who are in. But to me that says the problem out there isn't that people out there are oppressed. It's that there's people out there that aren't oppressed. So it makes an enemy out of the people who aren't oppressed, like white or rich people or straight people in some cases, as opposed to focusing on injustices in all cases. They go after the people who aren't oppressed.
That's right. Yeah, that's a big problem. It also goes to like tax loopholes. People who want to close tax loopholes. They don't realize that the answer to sort of that preferential treatment is to open up tax loopholes for more people, and so this notion of it's sort of like this Louis C.K. routine where he said that one of his daughters was upset because her doll broke, and so she wanted him to break her sister's doll to make up for it. And basically it's that same mentality, and that it just comes from just very base sort of animalistic impulses that people can have, but which they aren't willing to suppress.
Yeah. Let me backtrack a little bit, just because you mentioned an Orwell quote. I wanted to give that to anybody that might be curious. It's, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, from 1984. It's a wonderful Orwell quote, in one of his many times of insight, despite the fact that Orwell, of course, himself was a socialist. Moving on from there, Andy, I know you were referring earlier when we were discussing some of Dan's articles about the thick and thin libertarianism stuff. So let me pass the microphone, so to speak, to you for a minute and let you pick his brain.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think most people viewing this podcast are familiar with, or this video, are familiar with, like, the whole Charles Johnson essay, Libertarianism Through Thick and Thin. And one thing he talks about in there is thickness from grounds and thickness from strategy. Can you walk us through? I'd love your interpretation of kind of what those things are problematic. You wrote about this in your Medium article, Perils of Thick Thinking. Could you kind of walk us through the basic arguments with this thickness from grounds and strategy?
Sure, I'll have to sort of jog my memory a little bit. It's been a while. I will say that Charles Johnson is a friend of mine actually, and he's really great on most issues. I agree with him on like a lot of issues. Like he's really and a lot of left libertarians. I mean, they're very anti-war and they're very anti-police brutality, and a lot of them, very few of them are for the state, and so I don't want to give the impression that I'm like a sworn enemy against them, because
Right.
Especially Charles, I think he has a lot of great insights and does a lot of really important work. But I do disagree with him on this one particular issue about this whole idea of thick libertarianism. So thickness from grounds. Let's see, what was thickness from grounds? I think that was sort of the. Okay, what did I write here?
You've written a lot, so it's okay if you have to brush up on these articles.
This was last year, so okay. I say, to cut to the chase, I believe Johnson's basic conceit is that things that are related to libertarianism, thinly conceived, should also be considered a constituent identifying part of libertarianism, thickly conceived. Most, if not all, libertarians believe that certain values, modes of thought, and actions are prejudicial to the likely achievement of libertarianism, even if they aren't violations of libertarianism per se, and that still others are favorable to that achievement. Johnson subsumes that which favors libertarianism into libertarianism, calling it strategic thickness. Most, if not all, libertarians have some ideas, of course speculative and incomplete, concerning the pattern of results that more applied libertarianism might yield, as well as patterns of reality that result from violations of libertarianism. Johnson subsumes that which may result from libertarianism into libertarianism, calling it thickness from consequences. And finally, every libertarian has some underlying beliefs that serve as grounds for adhering to libertarianism. Such beliefs may also be grounds for adhering to other commitments as well. Johnson subsumes that which is based on the same grounds as libertarianism into libertarianism, calling it thickness from grounds. So basically, the general concern I have about this sort of linguistic innovation is that it's not necessary, and it's just rhetorically dangerous. So I don't think Charles himself is using it to advocate for any infringement of rights, but it's easy to see less principled people doing so. And so one of the examples that I use is how Herbert Spencer talks about how classic liberalism devolved and became statism. And what he said is that basically the liberals at the time started making thickness from consequences arguments. So they were sort of thick libertarians in that they said, okay, well, the reason that we like liberalism is that it benefits the masses. Liberalism, created all these high living standards by manufacturing, just daily items and lots of food for people to eat, and lots of shelter, and so since that is what liberalism is all about, then if we just more directly address those concerns through the state, then that's in the liberal spirit too. And so Herbert Spencer, that's basically the story, that Herbert Spencer, who was a contemporary, the contemporary storyteller of this, because he was, he's like a 19th century writer. So it's very, and he's a genius, and so it's a very, trustworthy reporter of this phenomenon. He says that that's what happened, that that people just started stretching the word, and so I just really believe in just keeping words just not stretched, keeping words just very limited
Precise.
and very precise to what you mean, because otherwise people can use sort of sophistry to just cloud issues and say that, oh, well, I'm really being for libertarianism, um, while advocating non-libertarian things.
Sure.
So I just don't like the idea of making words expansive, because then they become fuzzy, and then when words are fuzzy, then they're just really manipulable by by people with bad intentions.
Sure. Well, yeah, and that's a good segue to my next question, kind of building off of that same point, because when I hear Gary Chartier or Charles Johnson, who I agree with you are great libertarians, if we, I guess, thinly conceive them, they use, at least Gary does, talk about, well, if you're a thick libertarian, then you also you agree with the non-aggression principle, but then it also yields other thick commitments. And so even, I know I agree with you as well as the other guys on this panel here about being precise and the great value that it is. What do they mean when they say commitments? Are these oughts? Are these shoulds? Are we talking crimes versus sins? Are they saying, if you believe in these commitments, if you adhere to them, you won't be committing any sins per se, just to invoke some a religious context? But talk to me, because I think that's very dangerous when you talk about commitments. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they are normative propositions, so they are oughts and shoulds. For the most part, they're not. The left libertarians themselves are not merging or erasing distinctions between vices and crimes. It's just that what they say is libertarianism doesn't only speak to crimes, but also speaks to vices. And again, I
so
think
they are actually trying to enumerate some vices.
Yeah, some vices that they think are antithetical to libertarianism.
Okay.
And my concern with that is that other people who are less principled than they will use that, the making libertarianism into such an umbrella term to advocate treating vices as crimes. So,
right.
So they can say, yes, we agree with you that libertarianism involves, being against these certain vices, and but then, they can. It's just one step from that to saying well, isn't libertarianism about making sure that people's rights aren't infringed? And so if libertarianism is against this activity, then it should be outlawed. And so and to do that, it takes some sophistry. It takes some shifting definitions, but they're up to that task. They can do that, and it just makes it easier for them to do that when you expand libertarianism to include vices. It makes it easier for them to confuse vices with crimes. And so just on a practical matter, and just for clarity of communication, I think it's really important to restrict libertarianism to a discussion of crimes. And Because I just think that the discussion of crimes does deserve its own word. And again, it's a semantic thing whether you call it libertarianism or not, but it does deserve its own word. And so, like, they're not really leaving it with its own word by taking the word that's normally ascribed to it and making it more expansive. And so I think that the more you eliminate, the more you take away labels from important meanings, the harder it is you make it to clearly communicate. So really, it's just a point about communication and ultimately strategy from the communication. That just trying to make it,
Yeah.
not
Just
to give anyone any kind of like rhetorical weapons to use against liberty.
Well, and I think it kind of read my mind as far as talking about strategy really quickly, because I know Chris or Jeff might have some other things to talk about, but just the thickness from strategy, I think that really is the whole point, is that they're trying to reshape libertarianism a bit, based solely on how to strategically bring more people into the movement. But I think this is just my opinion, I'd want to get yours, it's counterproductive, because when you're taking libertarianism as we define it, or we, I guess, thin libertarians, if you want to call us that, it's very concise, it's very universally or universalizable, to use a Hoppian term, that can kind of be a common denominator. But when they try to add these appendages onto libertarianism, it really muddies the waters, and that's what I have a problem with. Is it becomes very unclear, and it's like just totally antithetical to what libertarianism, as we know it, really is. So, would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, and I think it depends on what you're doing with the appendages, because if anything, the appendages help avoid the problem that I'm talking about. Because it's one thing to tack on an appendage to libertarianism, in order to say, okay, we're talking about libertarianism plus additional commitments. But it's another thing to not tack on the appendage and just expand libertarianism. That's worse to me. So I'm actually okay with them adding an appendage if that keeps people from stretching, the definition of libertarianism itself. So if, people saying, okay, there are left libertarians and there are other libertarians, and left libertarians adhere to the libertarian core plus these other leftist commitments, that's fine. So that's their commitments. They can say that that's what commitments they have, and only we have these certain opinions about vices. That's when you get into trouble, I think.
Right, so you're trying to find a balance between I'm not the commissar of who is and is not libertarianism, but if we want to expand the population of libertarians by just loosening this definition to a meaningless degree, you're just saying we need to find a balance between that, because if libertarianism loses its meaning, the expansion of population of libertarians is pointless anyway, right?
Mm-hmm. And another risk is sort of baiting and switching. It seems that with some linguistic innovations, it seems like they're trying to. Some might be trying to appeal to people just because leftists or conservatives just like that word, the word that they're using. So if they're using the word social justice, even though they might mean something completely different from social justice, but it's sort of the idea might be, okay, well, at least I'll get them to listen to me because I'm sort of speaking their language, even though I'm not really speaking their language. I just sound like I am. But then, what happens when, what the leftists like about social justice is not, those string of letters. What they like about it is certain concepts. And so, this whole idea of just like bringing them in just sort of by tricking them with words that mean something different to you than it does with them, I don't see the advantage of that at all.
Absolutely. That's why we got Ron Paul supporters who are saying, "Well, I voted for Ron Paul. Now I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders." I think that's exactly why that's occurring. One election later. I think we need to move on because I know Jeff has some questions that he got from some of our left libertarian counterparts, and I would like to let him ask those with the time we have remaining.
Well, yeah. First of all, I think that you're very right about their use of terminology, and that's one of my biggest Another one of my biggest grievances with them, aside from what I mentioned earlier, that with their definitions shift throughout the discussion, where they get you with one definition. When you kind of break it down, they kind of get at you with another definition, and this is from someone that was on the chat earlier, is that they said that the way that some left libertarians wordsmith seem influenced by postmodernist deconstruction, they do not approach language from an Aristotelian logic form. And devil's advocate, as a lefty, I'd loathe to make a proposition, and also as a lefty, my favorite tactic for avoiding that is to refuse to define any terms or accept any real definition. That way, any critique of my position can be dismissed as a straw man, because that's not what I was even saying in the first place. I just want to say I agree with what you said with how fluid their definitions are. But back to the topic is that at least as far as thick libertarianism, and you said you're a friend with Charles Johnson, and I actually was speaking with left libertarian philosopher Charles Johnson and showed him your article, The Perils of Thick Thinking, where his response to me was, Dan is pretty hung up on the idea that my claims about thick versus thin conceptions are claims about the identity of libertarianism as a concept, but I don't think there are claims about that. And also to expand on this, Charles argued that there's nothing in the definition or concept of libertarian that would stop you from counting as one from being a racist misanthrope shut-in. What I'm saying is something about what people with a libertarian philosophy have significant reasons to do. It's not something about what the definition of libertarian is, or about who does and doesn't count as a libertarian. My biggest grievance, my issue I take away with what he said is that, on one hand, he's saying, I'm not saying who can and can't be a libertarian. You can have a racist libertarian, but I'm saying that people should consider these topics important on thick grounds or whatever. But on one hand, he's saying, I'm not saying who can be libertarians, but this is what libertarians should believe. So in a way, although he's saying libertarians, I'm not saying they should do this, but libertarians should do this. So he's kind of, in a way, he seems to be contradicting himself. But anyway, I just want to see what your thoughts on what his response to you was.
I at least from his original paper on the topic, I do think he was, from my reading of it, it really seemed unavoidable that he was talking not about sort of things that libertarians also could tend to accept or believe, but sort of the essence of libertarianism, like what the essence of libertarianism is, and so that's sort of the issue. I mean, again, like you're saying about definitions, that it seemed like what the argument that I make in my article is that he's conflating identity with relation. So all the different grounds that he has, I mean, all the grounds, the strategy, the consequences, all these things are things that are related to libertarianism, and in many cases,
complementary,
that are related to libertarians. libertarianism. But the thing is that relation is not identity. That it sort of like erases the whole concept of identity if everything that's related to the thing that you're talking about is also bundled up in its identity. Because, then what about things that are related to that? Are you going to bundle that into the identity of the thing? And by the same logic, you have no reason not to. And so by the same logic, you can, everything is related to everything. So, you lose all distinctions whatsoever. You're just everything is everything else. And so also he has this whole notion of I think when I had a discussion with him about it, he would talk about things that are not necessarily contrary to being a libertarian. And this may be what he was getting at with his response, but that are in tension. They have tension with libertarianism, and for me, I don't know. I just really like discussing words and whether other things are contrary to them. And so it's true that there are some things that would be like that I can understand tension in the sense that that if you have a certain grounds for your libertarianism, and that you have this other belief that is conflicting with those grounds, it's true that you have a problem because you're not agreeing with your grounds and this other belief that you have, but that's a problem with the grounds and the other belief. That's not a problem with libertarianism. That's a separate issue. So I mean, it's all very
It's fair to say, if I'm extrapolating this right, I can say you can be a libertarian and be a racist, but if you're a libertarian, you shouldn't be a racist. But that's because nobody should be a racist. Is that how we should be interpreting these statements?
Yeah. So you can consider the grounds for those two things: opposition to collectivism, and so then your racism is in conflict with your opposition to collectivism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In this case, that would be like collective identity, which would go back to your identity politics article, right?
Yeah, I think that one, especially Chris just mentioned that, especially how they, with it kind of conflicts, going back to identity politics, them being against, collective, them saying that they're for the individual so much as they stress about, but then they actually have these concepts such as social justice or group identity and groups acting when, if you think as a methodological individualist, society doesn't act, society doesn't deserve justice, only the individuals can experience injustice and justice, and it's a one viewpoint is conflicting a different viewpoint since, collectives can't act in any analytical or useful sense.
Yeah, and I think that there's warfare sociology on both the left and the right, and and even anarchist leftists can risk indulging in warfare sociology. That to the especially if they are advocating, expropriating capitalists, just not using the state to do it, and so that's where identity politics can be dangerous, because it's great to sympathize with victims of the state, but I think it's important to sympathize with all victims of the state, and not to sort of have certain constituencies where really you're trying to advance their cause, and see that's another issue of that's another issue of thick libertarianism, because like it's true that you have these other commitments, but when you bundle those commitments as part of libertarianism, then like I was saying at the beginning, for any given question about who owns what, there's one answer or another. You got to go one way or the other. And when you have sort of these commitments, if you've elevated other commitments to being another defining commitment of libertarianism along with the non-aggression principle, then it just becomes like sort of like a tug of war between those commitments, and then it becomes just like a question with any given question of justice and property rights. Then it just becomes an issue of, okay, which commitment am I going to go with? Because it's not necessarily going to be the same answer for whether you go with a non-aggression principle commitment or whether you go with one of your identity politics commitments. And so once you really start treating identity politics as a commitment that is part of your philosophy of justice, then it becomes a warfare sociology, because then it really is one herd against another, and you're just assigning property rights, but based on or control based on what herd you're part of, instead of the universal principles of the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, absolutely. I liked the identity politics article. That's actually the first article I read by you. I'm glad I got to hear you elaborate on it. All right, we're running short on time, so I have two brief closing questions I want to ask you, Dan. The first one, I see two busts in your background. One's clearly Ludwig von Mises. I'm not entirely certain who the other one is. Is it Hayek?
It's Murray Rothbard.
It's Murray Rothbard. Okay, it's a young Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard in his old age looks identical to my grandfather, and that's how I try to envision him. So that's my excuse for why I couldn't recognize a young Murray Rothbard bust. The second thing is, Dan, let's pretend for a second that I am voting for Bernie Sanders. I am not a libertarian, and you get to recommend one book that I'm going to read. What book would that be? I put you on the spot, I know.
I guess Bernie Sanders is Wrong by Tom Woods would be the most important.
Well, that's his recent free ebook, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Bernie Sanders is Wrong. If you just if somebody's going to read one, I'm actually asking because I'm probably going to go and buy whatever book you recommend to me because I like this kind of stuff. So give me a book recommendation, just a general one. The most important book to read.
Okay. Oh, just like, I guess For New Liberty.
I knew you were going to say that. Okay, good. Of course, yeah. we're all.
We said it like at the exact same time. It was perfect.
Yeah, we're all predict. I was either that or Man Economy and State. I was like, which is he going to say? Okay. Yeah. I figured, but I still wanted to see. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of We the Individuals Live. Dan, I think we've come to some consensus despite your earlier microaggressions against Mark Millar. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us. I think you have wonderful insights. And everybody, if you have not read any of Dan's writings, you owe it to yourself to go to dansanchez.me and spend some time perusing his articles. There is a lot of good stuff on a lot of different topics there. Until then, next week we will be back at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. We did an hour earlier to accommodate Dan's schedule, but next Wednesday we'll be back at our normal time. And we'll see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
And we just say